thank you, and thanks for having me here. As someone who works in the area of second language acquisition in corpus linguistics, this is a newer discourse community for me, and I've learned quite a bit over the last week looking at the presentations. Can you hear me? Great. And I'm going to use this talk to sort of introduce you to my discourse community, and hopefully you'll find something useful about it. Before we start, let's see, right here. Okay, that's not what I'm looking for. I want to make clear that the goal of the presentation today is basically to focus on how register analysis can be used, and I have two data sets that I'm going to show you using corpus linguistic methods. But the overall goal here to you is to really encourage you to consider how you might want to use some of these methods and an interpretive framework that will be applied to your own interests and your own research context. I've heard earlier today people talk about the wow factor. In corpus linguistics, we often refer to certain research as button pushing, right? So you push a button and you get these results, and then you jump up and down, and that's about all you do. But it's really important to go beyond that, and I think register analysis provides a good framework to do that. So the two perspectives I'm going to talk about today, and this is some recent work that I've been doing, is in the area of task-based language teaching, and to look at how task-based language teaching as it has been operationalized over the past 25, 30 years can also be reinterpreted from a different perspective, from a register analysis perspective, and looking at the ways that those two can intersect. And in some ways, I would argue the register analysis perspective will allow you a wider range of interpretation that ultimately I think would be better to push task-based language teaching forward. So when we look at the TBLT research, particularly the work that I've been interested in, it's how you describe task performance, the performance of particular tasks. There's been a lot of work on this from the interactionist perspective, looking at the role of interaction, how you measure interaction, hoping that you facilitate interaction. Also looking at it from the cognitive perspective, different views between Robinson and Skehan, and looking at the role of cognition in task complexity, also measured through these traditional measures generally of complexity, accuracy, and fluency, which I'll address later, and also looking at it from an assessment standpoint. So how do these performance features lead to some sort of increased competency or achievement? The way I look at it is what we're really doing, whether we're looking at task-based language teaching or we're taking a register perspective, is how do you account for variation, language variation? And as we'll see later, quite often, if you have a pre-existing measure of variation, like a complexity measure, and you don't find anything, there's nothing else to say, right? It's like, we didn't find anything. But I don't necessarily think that's the useful way of going about it. So from a task perspective, when we look at variation, we look at how language varies according to these task characteristics, whether it's the kind of information flow, or whether it's a divergent or convergent task, what the person's role is. Now from a register analysis perspective, the idea is that language varies according to situational characteristics, and you have things like the participants and the mode and the production circumstances, setting, purpose, topic. And when it varies, generally the linguistic features co-occur, and it's also done for a reason. There's a functional reason. And so for register analysis, you can describe the situational characteristics, you can identify the language features, but you also got to say why they're there, or at least guess why they're there. And so this kind of register analysis is generally done through corpus methods. and I'll talk about those in a little bit. So within corpus linguistics, many of us probably know this, there are two general ways of looking at variation. The first is what's called corpus-based, and that's where you have a set of features that you know occur in one context, and then you create a corpus and you look for the occurrence of those features and the relative frequency for in where you find them in a different situation of use. The other approach is what's called corpus-driven, and that's where you don't really have any idea of what the difference is, and you can do some corpus analysis and you get output, hopefully that is variant, and then you try to describe it that way. So in one way you have pre-existing conditions, pre-existing features you're looking for, and in the other way you really don't know what you're going to find. And so we call it top-down and bottom-up, and what I'm going to do now is talk about two studies, one that's top-down, straight register analysis, and then the other one is looking at a bottom-up way. I wouldn't call it register analysis, I'd call it using register analysis techniques and corpus techniques to see where the variation is. So that's what I'm going to talk about first. Is the first question here is, if you get enough tasks together, what do the language of tasks look like? So tasks sort of as a register. And the second part is applying that to smaller data sets and looking at language that varies under two different task conditions. So, excuse me. So the first study looks at how language features associated with spoken conversational registers. So what we know conversation looks like, how does it compare with oral communicative tasks? Now, of course, I would argue, although you might think of other reasons to do this, that one thing is really describing and understanding task language can help us in the way that we might design or sequence tasks over a period. But also, we might be able to identify certain situational characteristics of tasks that may help us foster interlanguage development, as well as understanding the task sequencing. So the first data set I looked at is what's called the CCOT, put together with my friend and colleague Kim McDonough. So for this data set, we collected 820 collaborative spoken tasks that were carried out in dyads. They were all used for, excuse me, formative assessment purposes, collected over a 4-year period. And the speakers were all from sort of intermediate to lower advanced. At this point, I'll plug the corpus because it's a pretty cool corpus, because not only do you have so much data, but we also have it completely transcribed and all the sound files, although I'm not going to analyze that today. It's a little over 300,000 words, and for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to consider it a representative sample of oral communicative tasks used for assessment purposes. The TBLT people, this is a huge data set. For corpus people, not so big, but I'm still excited about it. So what I did for the first thing, for the first study, is just look at certain frequency features and see how does it compare with how do the frequency features that we know happen in conversation, what do we find with the CCOT? And I'm looking just for the purposes of brevity at only 3, although there are many more you can do. So the first was looking at the functional characteristic of shared context, just looking at first and second and third person pronouns and what's the difference in the frequency of those. As far as interactivity, back channel responses, and as far as real-time production, I looked at filled pauses. And even though the corpus is 300,000 words, since the corpus I compared it to, which is the Longman grammar corpus, is 5 million words, the counts are sort of normalized to 1 million words. So I'll show you what I found. The first thing looked at first and second person pronouns. And as you see here, conversation had more first person, both subject and object first person reference, and a little bit more of second person pronouns. So kind of similar to conversation, but a little bit different. If you look at interactivity, the back channel responses that you get in the two corpora are pretty different. So conversation has a lot more back channel responses than what you get in the task corpus. And of course, we'll talk about some reasons for that. But here is what excited me. What do you think you get for filled pauses? Any guesses? Do you think the more in the task? Well, you get a few more in the task, yeah. Unbelievably, the task corpus has over 88,000 filled pauses per million words, where in conversation you get about 575. So this is a place where you can then use other corpus methods, particularly collocation research, to look at what's going on with those filled pauses. Where are they? What function are they serving? And so part of what you can do is look at what word is the most common word that's found to the right of a filled pause. And one of the things you see is they're all pronouns and they're all in the subject position. And if you compare the number of filled pauses you get in the object position, so like me or him or us, not so many. So those filled pauses are at a particular place in the corpus where they're basically buying time, and it tells you something about how the sentences are processed in real-time production. You can also look for the word to the right, and these are the most common words that come, to the left. So here you get and because, which are subordinators, and then you get these two verbs. Have is generally going to be an auxiliary verb, but you get think as well. And here I just have the lemma counts, but as you can see, for think, 781 times, it's think at 777 of them, so it's not thought or thinks. So what you can do when you look at this is sort of see how the filled pause and the left and the right collocates sort of fit together and what are they doing in the text. And what you see is a pattern kind of like this. You get this, I think, or I think, and they're fairly common throughout the corpus. And I think what's happening here is it's basically an unanalyzed chunk that gives them time to process the language. So lots of repeats, but then even when you get things like subject pronouns or you get verbs, I don't think they're really processed at all. They're just buying them time. So it's not just that's buying them time. There are lexical items as well that are there and buying them time. So I call it a processing time chunk. So quickly, the functional interpretation that you can give for a data set like this is, of course, for shared context, you get less reference to self than in conversation. The communicative purpose is different, right? It's not just for interaction. They have to exchange information, make decisions. The participants have assigned roles. They also have different proficiency levels than what we find in native speaker. But nevertheless, there are some reasons there for the differences. It's the same with interactivity, right? There are fewer back channels, of course, because it's not an authentic task. It's a task used for assessment purposes, and again, people have assigned roles, and they're concerned about being assessed, basically, given grades. But also, you get this real-time production information that's clearly there in the corpus, and it tells you something about the complexity of tasks. But what's interesting is if you break the tasks up into less complex or more complex, say with planning time, the filled pause differences aren't great. In other words, even when people have planning time, there aren't always more filled pauses. So that bears some interpretation at some point, but not today. So what I would say is the benefit of doing this sort of a register analysis, it first tells you the importance of designing tasks that encourage interaction, right? So probably more real-world type tasks, and not tasks where people have assigned roles. So part of what we have students doing now is when you have an assigned role versus when you are just yourself, what are the differences that you get there? And also, I think it's important to think that the amount of interaction could be a really important factor when you're thinking about how to sequence tasks. So one could argue that you want to maybe focus on more interaction at certain developmental levels or at certain times in the task cycle, and then maybe tasks that elicit less interaction as development occurs or as you're later in the task cycle. And also, this idea of real-time processing during task performance sort of suggests that we might want to, well, first it suggests that there are things that people do strategically to gain time. And so maybe what we want to do in task design is think of things we can do to give them time to plan, for instance, within task planning, and see if that has an effect on the types of disfluencies that they use. So that's an example of doing a register analysis of the whole tasks. Now the next thing, or the last thing I want to talk about, is looking at a smaller data set. So this is a study just completed, and it's in the area of collaborative writing, where you have individual and collaborative tasks. And one of the things that you find in pretty much all the collaborative writing studies is that collaborative texts are more accurate, but they're not more fluent. Fluency is measured basically by length, so I don't know why they call it fluency, but they do. And also it's not more complex. But the problem is, all the studies that I know of that have looked at this have used the T unit as an analysis of complexity. So they go through, they measure T units, and then they say, well, the collaborative's no more complex. So collaborative writing has no effect on complexity. But I would say no complexity doesn't mean no variation. And so one of the things you can do with register analysis, particularly bottom-up studies, is to say, well, how do they vary? Do they vary at all? And if they vary, why? So this is what this study did. And in order to do this, I created two sort of subtexts, because you have to control for topic. And so we have collaborative text, 32 of them, about 5,400 words, and then the individual text, 35 of them, pretty similar number of words. They differ by about 25. And then you can use I use these corpus-driven methods to identify any variation. The two I used for this study were, number one, lexical bundles, which were just frequent sequences of words that have identifiable forms and functions. They had to occur in at least 5 texts, because you have to make sure, especially with smaller data sets, but even with larger, that when you find something, it's not just 3 texts that produce it all the time and the other 30 don't have any. So it's what's called dispersion. So you want to make sure that they're dispersed across the text. And here's the software program I use, which is free. You probably have heard of it. And then I also did a keyword analysis, which is just words that you find in one group of texts that don't occur in the other. And I won't go into the technical aspects of it. And hopefully, well, you don't have to either, because you can just push a button. But then you got to interpret it and set the criteria and make sure that the features are actually relevant to look at. So here's what I found. First off, just quickly, for those of you who don't know about lexical bundles, there are different kinds of forms and functions of them, and these are just examples. I only found referential and discourse organizing bundles in the corpus. And so these are just examples of the kinds of bundles that were there in the corpus. So they either were using as a reference, or they were organizing the discourse in some way. And so to compare the two, the collaborative bundles, the frequency of them overall, there were 60 that met this criteria, and 32 for the individual texts that met them. So the collaborative writers are writing using more of these bundles. And also the distribution of the bundles was quite different. So here I have the bundle frequency. It doesn't tell you the actual bundle, but as you can see on the left, the most frequent bundle in the collaborative was that there were 25 of them, but they occurred in 20 of the texts. And then it goes down from there. Whereas you see with the individuals, the most frequent was 14, and it only occurred in 8 of the 35 texts. So that's a pretty important difference, I'd say, even if a T unit doesn't tell you that there are complexity differences. Also, if you look at the distribution of the function of the bundles, just as a proportion, the collaborative writing equally distributed across these two types of bundles, form, noun phrase and verb phrase bundles, whereas the individuals also included a clausal bundle as well. Some might call that more complex. I just call it different for now. And if you look at the function of the bundles, again, you see some differences. I mean, they're small, but you see that the tendency for collaborative writing is that they're using these two functions equally, whereas in the individual writing, there's a tendency towards using referential bundles. So I think it's fair to say that collaborative text condition resulted in more bundles distributed across a wider range of texts, fairly equal distribution and of the form, and a fairly equal distribution of the function. Whereas the individual texts had fewer bundles across fewer texts, and these tendencies to produce VP and referential bundles. Okay, so finally, we looked at a keyword analysis, and I'm not going to go into the the way of doing it. Have you heard of keyword or keyness? So I'll just show you the differences. So in the collaborative texts, these were the words that were more common, that were found in the collaborative text that did not occur in the individual texts among the university and students. Whereas in the individuals, you get first-person pronouns or second-person pronouns, basically this looks like spoken language, right? And these are learners at the same proficiency level, doing the same task, on the same topic. And so what I have here is just an example of what they look at. So here we have the collaborative text and the keywords are highlighted, whereas in the individuals, you see a lot of these pronouns, and again, that they're co-occurring. So at this point, again, whether you want to call it collaborative or not, the benefit of doing this kind of analysis is that you're finding differences and that you have to say something about them. What's going on? So you might hate what I have to say, but this is what I think is going on. And if you have any ideas, share them with me, please. I think what's going on is that the collaboration, and we have, I should tell you that we have the interactions recorded, but we haven't analyzed them completely yet. So that will ultimately tell us a little bit more. But collaboration is really pushing these learners to use their linguistic resources in a different way than when they write individually. So they tend to write more formulaic, and as Steve suggested, maybe that's a good thing, right? And also individual writing, when you look at the keyword analysis, it looks more like spoken language. So it could be that what's happening is that the lack of interaction during the writing process for learners at this proficiency level results in them sort of interacting with the text or interacting with the reader in a very different way, a more of an interactional way. So given these two studies, I just sort of want to end with some general implications. The first is register analysis, which we did for the first study, and then what I would call register analysis techniques are a really useful methodology or framework to understand things like task complexity, task difficulty, task conditions, because you get information that tells you how people are using this language and for what functions. And I would argue that TBLT research would really benefit from looking at things not from a complexity model, but from a variationist model. Just how are they different? Are they different? That's the first step. Because sometimes if you just go straight to complexity, you're going to miss the kinds of analyses that I've shown you with the second study. And also, maybe for you in this new discourse community, for me, would be able to use this, because in essence, what I would argue is register analysis can be seen as a theoretical framework because it predicts variation, and then there is some function that's associated with it. And more recent research, I think, is starting to accept this idea that it's not just descriptive. So I hope maybe that you're able to buy it at least a little bit. And I'd also like just to acknowledge the funding agencies and the research assistants. So, thanks.